Alright, so welcome back to my newest installment of Laserdisc pickup videos, and this one's going to be quite a bit of a big one because I've got a backlog to go through. So we're going to start by going chronologically, and that means starting with one of a number of RKO Classic Collection discs I picked up, inching me ever so closer to trying to complete the run of RKO image releases. So this is a film from 1932 from obviously RKO. This is the Phantom of Crestwood. And again, with a lot of these discs, it's usually a film that's a bit more obscure, maybe didn't get a DVD release, or maybe even didn't get a VHS release after this point. So again, this is a film I've not really heard of, but it's got some principles I'm familiar with, and was produced by Marion C. Cooper just before he produced King Kong at RKO. So standard style jacket, a little bit of crumpling, but again, when these pop up for affordable prices, I just snap them up without thinking. It does have a hole punch, which indicates it might have been a promo disc at some point, but looks like a nice solid RKO title, digital mono track, otherwise just a standard release in the way Image was doing these. It wasn't until the very end of the run that they started doing fancier covers and the occasional commentary as an extra, but again, anytime I find one of these, it's a must purchase. Now, a really nice release from 1935 of A Midsummer Night's Dream, produced by Max Reinhardt, which was pretty much the pinnacle of studio production. They put every star they could get in it. Beautiful, gorgeous artwork. The whole packaging for this is a cut above the usual standard MGM UA jacket. It does have a digital mono track and a really nice gatefold, which again, even though it's in their standard style, it really fits with this film with the usage of color. It does include the original trailer and then a number of other teaser trailers. Each one basically featured a various star that was in the film that was part of the ad campaign materials. So it's pretty cool. They managed to find all of those and put them on here. And then you get a nice little liner note paragraph here. So again, a cut above the usual standard MGM UA jacket, and the rear also looks really nice. So it's just the movie only outside of that really nice grouping of trailers, but this was definitely much more cleaned up over the previous versions. And even though it is stylized and of its time, it's a really handsome production. It's very handsomely mounted. But anyway, this was the studio firing on all cylinders. So this was the peak of production and really the prestige picture of the year for the studio. So very nicely done. Next up, from 1938, another one of these Image RKO Classic discs, and this one actually picked up still sealed, so this should be pretty nice. This is the Mad Miss Mantin with Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck, and as you can see, it still has the original sales sticker of $14.99 each, or 2 for $22. So I always love finding the original promo stickers or any sort of price sticker from the store back in the day, but even for some of these rare RKO titles, that's not a bad deal, because some of these can be quite rare and get quite pricey. Again, same design as the rest, and it does have the original store sticker with the $14.99 price on there. It does look like a familiar sticker. I just can't place what store it is because it doesn't have the actual store logo on it. But I can't tell if that's like a media play sticker or another similar older bookstore no longer in existence. But anyway, and it is a image disc RKO Classic Collection with a digital mono track, and as you can see, the jacket printed in USA and the discs are manufactured in Japan. So next up, from 1942, this is an MGM UA release of a Bette Davis film that's in some, I can't remember which one. It's in one of the Bette Davis collection box sets from Warner Brothers, but I don't think it's coming to Blu-ray anytime soon. And that is The Man Who Came to Dinner, with a pretty good cast and directed by William Keighley, who's a very underrated studio director of the period. Really a truly great director, I'd argue. Anyway, really nice looking release. I do like the cover art, and even though it is a bit stylized as MGM UA would do with all their classic titles, it looks really nice and has a digital mono track. It's just a single disc because the film is a bit shorter, but it does include the original trailer and the rear art is pretty nice. So all in all, a nice solid catalog upgrade for this film, which eventually came out on DVD, but I don't know, it might come out on Blu-ray at some point, because this year there's been a run of announcements from different labels that they're doing various Bette Davis titles, but it's pretty much the bigger ones like Jezebel and now Voyager and some others. But you know, hopefully that gets the ball rolling, because this film is pretty good. And with the prestige of this crew list, you know, written by the Epstein brothers, directed by William Keighley, from the play by George Kaufman, you know, there's quite a bit of prestige going on here. So an underrated film in the Bette Davis filmography for sure. Another one in the RKO Classic Collection line from 1943. This is Around the World. Again, a film I have not seen, but anything with the RKO Classic banner is an instant I gotta try it. Again, digital mono track, but other than that, the same packaging design as the others. A little bit beat up, and as usual for most of these I ever see or pick up, they have a corner hole punch somewhere, meaning they were usually promos or sale discs, because this line got really obscure in the titles they chose. And as I said before, some of them have never even been released on DVD or anything else. So that makes the rarer and harder to find titles in this line very much important, because some of them, that's the best video release there is. So again, just another step closer to a complete RKO set. Next up from 1947, this disc is a Fox disc, and it's still actually in the shrink wrap, which is pretty cool. But anyway, this is the Fox release of Gentleman's Agreement, with really nice cover art. Again, this was the point there they were starting to use the whole jacket and just keeping the standard CBS Fox bar logo on the bottom. It does have a digital mono track, so this is after they started adding digital tracks finally. And as you can see, it still has the original price stickers, and it does have a bit of a hole punch, so I guess this one was marked for sale too. The rear is the standard style Fox sleeve, but again on this lighter bluish background. I guess it's a little bit more prestigious looking, because this film was one of the big you know, heavy-hitting dramas of its day, and a Academy Award winner and a big award picture, and still holds up extraordinarily well. Directed by Elia Kazan, of course, and it is highly recommended if you've never seen it. There is a really nice Blu-ray out there from Fox, but I wanted to check out this on Laserdisc, and of course, anytime there's a classic title and it's got digital audio and it's not a super expensive title, then I'm totally there. But yeah, this is pretty much the best version on Laserdisc. The older one was a analog-only disc from the early 80s. So, moving on with another Fox title that's an upgrade of a much older disc. This is, of course, from 1950, the classic All About Eve. And as you can see, this being the updated version from the mid-90s, it has the more stylized art that was, of course, designed for VHS parameters and used on the first DVD. Was a fresh transfer, so it was used on everything from this point until the first Blu-ray, where they did a new scan. But anyway, it's a really nice master. It's got a digital mono track, unlike the previous version, so that's really the reason to upgrade. It does have a nice bit of liner notes. This is much like what you'd see on the Grapes of Wrath reissue Fox did, or Captain from Castile, some of the other later Fox titles that I have. And as you can see, it's later on in the 90s, because it has the upgraded 20th Century Fox logo here on the bottom. But other than that, it does have the theatrical trailer, and that's really all there is for extras. You'll have to turn to the Blu-ray or the special edition DVD for extras and a commentary. However, Criterion announced they're going to do a Blu-ray from a 4K scan, so that should supplant the old Blu-ray, so we will all probably upgrade yet again. But if you're looking for this film on Laserdisc, this should be the edition that you're looking for, and it is a little bit more elusive. Usually you have to pay a little bit more. I had to wait a while before I finally found one, and then right after I find one, Criterion announces their Blu-ray, of course. But anyway, this is the version on Laserdisc that you should be seeking should you want to see this film on the format. Next up, from 1956, another in the RKO Classic line, This is Death of a Scoundrel with the absolutely fantastic, as always, George Sanders. And again, a film I've never seen and I'm looking forward into diving into. And of course, because it's an RKO disc from Image, it's got a hole punch somewhere. So I think almost all of my RKO discs have a hole punch in them, but just the fact that I find them is good enough. I don't mind that they have hole punches. I just think it's kind of funny. I guess these all sat on a lot of shelves in stores for a while because people were like, what the heck is this? I've never heard of this. But anyway, this should be a nice, fun watch, so I don't have to catch it on TCM at like 2 o'clock in the morning or whenever it would air. But anyway, one step closer in RKO completion. Next up, from 1960, this one is a true science fiction classic and still the best adaptation of this novel, which is one of the great novels of all time. I'm of course referring to the George Pal version of The Time Machine, the letterboxed edition from MGM UA. Of course, since the film has passed back to Warner Brothers, and they've put out a DVD and then a pretty decent Blu-ray, actually. It's one of the few classic titles they've done on Blu-ray, and it's on the main studio label. But of course, it's got very modernized looking artwork, and this art is just fantastic looking. You get the MGM letterbox banner across the top. It does have a digital mono track, and again, this was the first time you could see the film letterboxed. The jacket's a little dirty, a little dinged up, and it's got some dirt and staining and such, but for the price I paid, I'm okay with that, because usually this can be a little bit on the pricey side, and a lot of people still really love this film, and so that anytime you have that, it makes copies be a little bit more pricey, a little bit harder to come by. And I just really wanted to check out the transfer on this, and I have to say it does look really nice. Has pretty decent color, and the sound is really good, but I haven't gotten the Blu-ray yet. I just remember reading the reviews. I've really got to pick that up. I've been meaning to get it for some time. But anyway, again, this is still to date the best version of the classic H.G. Wells novel. I don't think it's perfect because it is also a product of its time. If you've seen any other of George Pal's famous works, especially his 1953 version of The War of the Worlds, you know they can deviate some from the source material, but this one actually stays extraordinarily faithful to the book. But there are elements of the book that have still kind of missed out on being adapted. But this is definitely the best and the closest of all the adaptations. I'd say it comes closest in feeling, of course, to Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was made 6 years previously. It sort of fits in that vein, and of course predated the other big Verne adaptation, Mysterious Island, by a year. So it fits in that sort of time frame, and it's right there with the other adventure films of the era and the Harryhausen films and other things. So, and it is still delightful. So definitely a nice Laserdisc to pick up. It includes the original theatrical trailer, but that's pretty much it for extras. Next up is a film I've never seen, but I've seen pieces of it, and I've always wanted to see it all the way through. This is a pretty nice Paramount widescreen reissue. This is the 1964 film The Carpetbaggers, with this really nice artwork, actually. Pressed by Pioneer, so this is definitely Paramount when they stepped up their game in about 93, 94, and it's right in there with all their mid-90s reissues where, again, they just totally elevated their quality across the board. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that they started including extras, because you can't have everything. But this is a really nice transfer. It has a stereo PCM track, so I don't know if this film was originally mono or if it had some sort of magnetic stereo mix, but I haven't got to spin this all the way through yet, but it is credited as stereo down here on the bottom. But the reviews of this are pretty good, and I've always heard good things about it, and I've seen pieces of it on TCM and other places, but just have never gotten to see it all the way through. And I think they did put this out on DVD, and it was pretty much just the Laserdisc recycled. So at least this way you get nice artwork on a Laserdisc jacket, and you get a PCM track. But again, one of these that I've just been meaning to catch up to for years. And with that being said, here is another Paramount title of a film I've heard of and trying to catch up to for a long time. This also fits in with my insane desire to finally see all the other works of the classic Bond directors. So this is the 1965 picture, The Amorous Adventures of Moll Flanders, which was directed by Terence Young. I believe, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, this was the film he completed just before Thunderball, and it came out in 1965. So I think this was the film he was shooting while Goldfinger was being made. Didn't do extraordinarily well at the box office or anything, and like a lot of the other films the Bond directors did, it doesn't have a lot of availability. So this Laserdisc is still about the best way to see it in this country. Again, Paramount mid-90s reissue in widescreen finally, pressed by Pioneer. Really nice art too, but I was exceptionally happy to finally get this because it's not common, and I mean, it's not rare and expensive, but it gets on up there in price usually. No special features, just a widescreen transfer movie only, but again, finally nice to actually have a copy of this to finally be able to see it. And again, I think Terence Young was horrendously underrated, and I'm happy to see anything else he ever did, and it seems like it's a relatively good film that was just not really given a good reception back in the day. So again, Paramount was really stepping up their game with these mid-90s reissues. And then they started digging into the vaults and doing more obscure titles like this. Unfortunately, of course, this did not really continue over into the DVD era for that long. Next up, from 1966, this is the Fox widescreen release of Two for the Road, which of course has a really nice cleaned up version on Blu-ray, but this one was just in really nice shape in one of the local shops for literally a quarter, so I couldn't say no. This film is quite underrated if you've never seen it. Standard Fox jacket. It does have a digital track, which I believe is mono. And here it does indicate that there is a director commentary by Stanley Donen, but it's listed as audio insights, so it's not like a full commentary. It's just small pieces of conversational talking or so. But it is cool that they put that on here because this was still very early on in the days of audio commentaries. You get this really nice gatefold with very well printed stills, and again on a black background as Fox would do at this point. You get a little bit of liner notes about the film, the cast and crew, but it's at least something nice to have, even though the film's just on a single disc. So they were giving this much more of its due, even though the Laserdisc itself is not anything fancy. Again, PCM mono track, single CLV disc. The real draw here is the art and the director commentary track that's not a full commentary track, but yeah, it's been supplanted by the DVDs, and of course there's a Blu-ray out there as well, but this is quite a nice film to go back to, and a pretty nice Fox release from this era, actually. Now here is one I have tried to find for an exceptionally long time, almost when I started collecting Laserdiscs. This was one of the first titles I added to my database wish list, and that is the 1997 reissue of Blazing Saddles. And the reason why this is the only version on Laserdisc that's actually in widescreen, the earlier ones are pan and scan, because Saddles was shot in scope. But this is the last release to have the film's original mono track. All the later ones have a 5.1 remix, which is just unnecessary. This does have the very sporadic commentary by Mel Brooks, which runs about half the length of the film that showed up on the DVD later on. And of course uses the poster art across the whole jacket, whereas the earlier release has it just on a yellow background. Show you the rear. And you can tell this is definitely a Warner's late release. It's handled by Image, so that makes it much harder to come by. It's not super rare. You can get it for decent prices, but it does take some time to find one that's not super expensive. And yeah, pretty much outside of the trailer, the Mel Brooks semi-commentary, as you can see, it's listed as being 55 minutes long, so it's a hour-long commentary. So you can watch the commentary for like half the movie, and then you're just like, okay, where'd it go? which is what I did when I first rented the DVD back in the day. And I was like, oh, cool, there's a commentary. And I listened to it. And then I was like, where'd it go? Where'd it go? And then I looked at the back of the box and saw, oh, it's not a full commentary. Okay. But this is much improved over the older disc. This is the version to own on Laserdisc, and I definitely would recommend it because, again, it's the best release of the film's mono track, which has never been reissued. When they did the big Blu-ray reissue, they gave it a better video encode than the very early Blu-ray, which I think was released in 2007, so it's a super early Blu-ray. But you'll want to get the reissue one with better video quality, but it still doesn't have the mono track. So this is one that could definitely use a 4K remaster. Even the master on the Blu-ray is pretty old, and hopefully the mono track can be restored at some point. But this is still a great way to watch it if you haven't seen it in a while. Now, next up is a picture from, let's see, this picture is from 1985, so we're jumping ahead a bit. I've never seen this, but I've read it referenced in histories of late era 80s MGM. This is the MGM letterbox release of Mrs. Soffel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, because again, I've only read about this, I've never seen it. This is one of the films that came out during the struggles of MGM during the 1980s, and came out to mixed reviews, not very good box office, so I've always wanted to see it. So anyway, this Laserdisc popped up. It's the standard MGM letterbox style, but the cover looks pretty nice, and it's not a super common disc, so I was happy to find it. It does include the theatrical trailer and a Dolby Surround encoded PCM track, but that's it. There's no gatefold or extras or anything, so it's just a single CLV disc. But anyway, I'm going to spin this up and check out the film finally. And, it seems like an interesting concept, so hopefully it's pretty good. Like I said, I've just read about the on-set changes and stuff, which went on with a lot of 80s MGM product. So, keeping with the Mel Gibson theme, I suppose, this is a 1990 release, of course, the Universal letterbox release of Bird on a Wire, which is another film that I've seen chunks of it countless times on cable, but I've never seen it all the way through, and I figured the Laserdisc would be a nice place to start. Carries a Dolby Surround encoded digital track. Of course, this predates AC3, so none of that. And the interesting thing, this is, sort of a romantic comedy action film directed by John Badham, so and even the pieces I've seen, it's like a strange mix of a hybrid film. So again, I've never seen it all the way through, so I figured it'd be fun to start with this Laserdisc. And I gotta say, the rear art looks pretty nice, but otherwise it's just the standard kind of generic feeling Universal layout. So this is a super common disc, but it's just one I've never found a nice clean copy of for cheap. Usually when I find a nice clean common that I'm looking for, it's in some store where for some reason all discs are like $5 or $10 each, and I'm like, yeah, no, I think I'll wait. So I was very happy to finally get a clean copy of this. Now here's another super common title that I was happy to pick up because it was finally a clean one that was dirt cheap. Because you've got to have some Steven Seagal apparently at all times. So here is the Warner Brothers release of Hard to Kill. Pretty nice looking artwork, I must say, and since I've been watching other, Seagal films and finally catching up on the Seagal filmography, I figured, well, might as well check off another one. The reason why I held off on picking this up for a while, this is one of the Warner discs that for some reason they put out, and it is a 1:3:3 transfer. So I think this film was matted widescreen, so I think this is just open matted. I don't think it's a pan and scan of a scope film. But for some reason, like all the other films Warner put out of Seagal titles, they're all widescreen for the most part, but for some reason this one is full frame. So that's just something to note. And it does have a Dolby Surround track, but I think this one also doesn't have digital sound. I think it's just analog Dolby track. Or I may be wrong, because as you can see, Warner Brothers does not indicate any of this stuff at this time. I do know this one is full screen, and I don't know, this might have digital sound. I can't remember for sure, but either way, it is surround encoded. But since this one was literally less than $1 and in good shape, I figured I might as well pick it up and finally see this. So again, this is just one of those weird Warner's discs that they decided, yeah, you don't need widescreen. So, and when you have Seagal, I guess you have to have some Van Damme as well. So this is another that I've never quite seen all the way through, and I figured if I ever found the Laserdisc, I'd pick it up. Of course, there's a more pricey DTS version, but this is just the standard universal release of Timecop, letterboxed, and you wouldn't notice this at first, but this is actually a THX mastered disc because their logo is tucked in here. So it's letterboxed, has a Dolby Surround encoded PCM track, but of course being universal, that means no AC3 because they were pure DTS at this time, and then the DTS Laserdisc came out a couple years later, and of course is much rarer, much pricier, much harder to find. So I figured I'd give the film a whirl on this standard Laserdisc copy. It's in really nice shape, and you'd be surprised how difficult it can be to find, you know, especially action films where they would get pulled out and played a lot and kind of worn out, especially on the jackets, by people just, you know, firing up their favorite action film night after night. But yeah, it's very difficult sometimes to find cheap, inexpensive, well-priced, good condition common action titles. So this was a nice find. Again, it's a cheap disc with a THX mastering, so if you're big on the THX seal of approval, you can pick this one up, and it's one of those kind of stealth THX discs. It's on there, but most people don't realize that it is a THX mastered disc. All right, so that winds down the whole chronological run. Now I'm going to go through the one animated title I picked up, and this one is quite rare, actually. This is a series that's never been released in its entirety, and I believe 2 Laserdiscs were released, each with 2 episodes, and there were also a couple VHS tapes, but this was a short-lived series that practically nobody liked, and it's never been released in its entirety. So this is the very ill-fated 1993 revision series of Speed Racer, which was produced here in the States, and I don't think had anything to do with the original Japanese owners. So this was produced by Speed Racer Enterprises here, has a really god-awful rendering of the iconic original theme song, and I've only seen little clips of it, but when this popped up in a seller's ad, and it's still sealed, so I was like, well, I'm never going to see it again for this cheap. Again, they only released, I think there's only one other Laserdisc with 2 episodes, and then, like I said, a couple random VHS tapes, but you can look up clips online. It doesn't look pretty good. Basically, they tried to combine the idea of Speed Racer with like a bunch of other kids cartoons, so it's like Speed Racer meets Transformers meets G.I. Joe meets like 10 other things, and then they were trying to sell a bunch of toys too. It does have digital sound. It was released by Family Home Entertainment, so the quality should be pretty good. And now I will finally force myself through, 4 episodes of this show and see if it's really that bad. But again, no other major releases of this, so this is pretty hard to come by. Now on to my sole Criterion pickup. This is one that's very difficult to find, and I picked this one up still sealed at a very great price, so I was very happy to do this. But this is one, you don't necessarily need it because the commentary's been ported online, but I've always wanted to see the transfer and check out the audio track on here. But this is, of course, Spine number 133, the Criterion release of Bad Day at Black Rock, which, even though it doesn't use the original poster art, there's something about the color and the cropping of this particular still, what they chose for the jacket. I just really like the way this looks. It's just a single CLV disc, but it was the first release in widescreen. It predated the MGM widescreen release by a little bit. But it does have a more of a mono track than the stereo, the magnetic stereo that the film released in originally. And that's on the MGM disc, and that's also on the DVDs and the Warner Archive Blu-ray. But the real draw is, of course, the pretty infamous commentary recorded by the director John Sturges. People have lauded it for years, and I think it was Paul Thomas Anderson, who said it was like going to film school for 2 hours listening to that commentary, and he's quite right. It's at the same standard as the Great Escape commentary on the Criterion release, but of course that was shared with other people, and this is pretty much 2 hours. Well, it's slightly less than 2 hours. It's about an hour and a half really of just full on John Sturges, and that's literally like that's beyond a masterclass. That's just realizing what it means and what is the craft of being a motion picture director. And you do get this really nice Criterion essay here. So again, not as good technically as the MGM disc you can pick up for a lot cheaper, and it doesn't have the full stereo surround that was taken from the magnetic stereo. But that being said, it's a really nice presentation. It was the first time the film was shown in widescreen, and it is a crime to see this film pan and scanned. The widescreen composition is integral to the film. This was an early CinemaScope film. And again, this was the first time you could actually see it properly, but the commentary is just phenomenal. And so we go from Criterion to the couple of series entry discs that I picked up. I like to keep all my various series and franchises together. So going in alphabetical order, we go to scraping the bottom of the proverbial barrel with the Paramount release of Beverly Hills Cop 3. Again, this is not a film I think anybody is fond of, but if you have the first one, occasionally you spin through the second one, and then very, very infrequently you're like, 3 isn't as bad as I remember, and then you revisit it and you realize that you were wrong. So, all that being said, it is a top, higher tier Paramount release for the era. It's letterbox, has the THX seal of approval. It does have a Dolby Surround encoded digital track. It doesn't have AC3, and every time I think of this, I think this has AC3, and it doesn't. I do think because the film did come out in the early 90s, it could have had and should have had at least Dolby Digital in the theatrical release, but of course this predates it on Laserdisc. I think this came out obviously a bit before Clear and Present Danger, but so no AC3. But again, if you're a glutton for punishment and you're wanting to revisit this film, you can usually pick up this for pretty cheap. It's a lot harder to find the letterboxed reissues of 1 and 2. I only have the letterbox 1, and then I have the first 2 on DVD, which have some commentaries and extras and stuff. So the Laserdisc isn't really essential, but again, I was just finally ready to sit through this again and see if it's maybe somewhat better than I remember. But yeah, it's just not good. So every once in a while you have to spin through this. So it's a pretty decent Laserdisc, and again, you do get the THX seal, and it's a better Paramount release from later on in the 90s. And the other series disc I picked up is a massive uptick in quality, and one I've looked for a long time because both of these films are very difficult to find on Laserdisc. So I have the film's sequel, but I was still missing the Fox letterbox release of Man Flint, which, unlike a lot of Fox discs from this period, and the sequel to this as well, it uses the original iconic poster artwork, looks really great on the old school Fox jacket, and like the sequel, also has a really awesome gatefold with a bigger rendering of the film's art, some great little liner notes, great images, great printing on this jacket as well. It is still a single CLV disc, but again, this was the first time you could see this film properly in CinemaScope for the first time since its original theatrical release. And a lot of the appeal of this film was the fact that it was trying to give a sense of grandeur. So they shot it in CinemaScope for good reason. And, growing up, I would see these films on television and fell in love with them, but it was always weird seeing them pan and scanned because you could very clearly tell you were not seeing everything, and all the old pan and scan transfers are very contrasty and just didn't look very good. But it was a revelation finally seeing them in widescreen. So it's really cool to be able to go back to the Laserdisc and see them, how they looked in widescreen the first go around. It does have a digital mono track. This film, because it was CinemaScope, but it was CinemaScope at the very end. In fact, in the sequel, In Like Flint, was the last film released in the original CinemaScope form. So these are, right there with films that have, you know, the CinemaScope lens problems, the distortion, the mumps, all that stuff, even though they are 1960s films. But again, I don't know if they ever had a full-on CinemaScope stereo release like a lot of earlier CinemaScope films did. But usually you just find them with mono or a 5.1 remix of said mono track. So that's what you get on the digital tracks, and no extras. You can turn to the DVDs for that. They have a pretty nice commentary and a little extra or two. Twilight Time did these on Blu-ray, and they went out of print and sold out very quickly, and I missed those, and I'm still mad at myself. So now both films are on Blu-ray for pretty astronomical amounts. They were very early Twilight Time discs, and no one else has released them on Blu-ray, so your best bet to see them now is on the pretty cheap DVDs, or go all the way back to the Laserdisc for the more vintage experience. But they are very difficult to find on Laserdisc, so I was very happy to finally pick up the first film to go with the sequel. Moving on to the director's shelf of director pickups. This is a title that's very difficult to come by. This was also in the Columbia Classics series, pressed in 1994, but I've never seen like any physical copies ever. And I didn't even know it was out until I found it on the database. But this is the upgrade Columbia Pictures Award winner edition of the Immortal It Happened One Night, directed of course by Frank Capra, and uses the original art that was used on pretty much press stills only, but this is just a gorgeous image. This copy is still sealed, so it's in very good shape. And again, I think this is the just about the rarest of the Capra titles on Laserdisc. It's not super rare, but it's just one I never see, so I was very happy to find it. Has a digital mono track, of course, and I just wanted to pick this up to check out the transfer, and because the cover's gorgeous, and I had most of the other Capra titles, and since I have them on most every format already, I figured, well, I might as well pick it up on Laserdisc too. And here on the rear, like a lot of the other Columbia Classic discs, you have one of the film's really lovely original posters. But no real extras here. I think this was also based, a lot of the Capra titles got Library of Congress restorations in the early 90s, and there were various attempts over the years to treat them better and clean them up some. So I think this was based on that, just like the Laserdisc of Mr. Smith was. So this is better than the previous video versions, but of course it's not even going to, you know, approach the later DVD, and then of course the Criterion release, which is based on even further restoration work and better materials becoming available, so on and so forth. But this is just, you know, one of the Immortal films. This is one of the founding bedrocks of romantic comedy, and really the film that made not only Capra a legend, but Clark Gable as well. So continuing on with Capra, this was the other Columbia Pictures award-winning series Capra title that I was missing. Sadly, they never did Lost Horizon on Laserdisc. That waited pretty much until DVD. The Lost Horizon Laserdisc is a much earlier analog-only disc that's not super great, and was, of course, when the film was still in the process of being restored further. That film has been pieced back together over various restorations that have stretched from the early 70s until now. So this is another one, not as common as some of the others, but this is the reissue of You Can't Take It With You, which is supremely underrated, and another Immortal Capra-Riskin collaboration. Robert Riskin, the screenwriter who wrote a significant number of Capra's most famous pictures. But anyway, in the same style sleeve, it's in a really glossy jacket this time, and as you can see, it still has the sort of faint marbling that's on all these Columbia jackets. Because the film is a bit longer, it is 2 discs, and they're just shoved in a sleeve, so there's no gatefold, which is why there's some wrinkling and such. It's just pretty much going to happen whenever somebody does that. It's a thinner cardboard, but at least you get the nice glossiness. You get this nice vintage lobby card poster on the back, and a little bit of liner notes. Again, this was the subject of continuing restorations, so if you go back to the older versions of this on Laserdisc and the original DVD, the quality is not going to be all that great because this film was, very badly treated over the years, and the current run of Capra Blu-rays and 4K restorations are really astonishing, but it took an extraordinary long time for these films to be able to be presented even in that quality, and the Blu-ray of this film and the 4K master still show source limitations because, again, these were printed to death, reissued to death, and just the original materials were not treated well at all. I do think this film is absolutely essential, just like all the other major Capra titles, but it's the one that's probably this one, along with Meet John Doe, because that film fell into the public domain, are the ones that are not talked about as much of the main Capra titles. So I'd say it's this and Meet John Doe. Wow. So I'd argue that it's this film and Meet John Doe, along with the earlier Capra titles like Bitter Tea of General Yen, that are the really underrated, forgotten gems of his career. But again, this film is fantastic, and in a lot of ways, I think very deservedly won the Best Picture Oscar for that year. One more Capra title. This is a reissue of a disc that was, of course, done by Criterion first. This doesn't have any extras like the Criterion and seems to use the same source transfer, so they're relatively interchangeable. So this is the MGM UA reissue of Arsenic and Old Lace. And don't let the cover fool you. This is not a colorized version, thank God, but uses a similar image that Criterion does, but they print the image of Carrie in the window in black and white, whereas this goes for full color, and the image placement and layout with, the sort of floating heads everywhere is in the standard MGM UA video design. I would argue this probably has been maybe finessed a little bit more. If you watch the first 5 or so minutes of the Criterion, the first 5 or so minutes of this, you'll notice a difference. The Criterion credits are window boxed, whereas this one is not. A couple little things like that, but otherwise it's the same source element and transfer. Both have a digital mono track. Again, no extras, no trailer or anything, but if you just want to see this film again, you can pick up this disc. Later on, Warner put it on an early snapper case DVD, which recycled this Laserdisc. It's never been revisited for HD. It's a prime candidate for the Warner Archive or for Criterion to do again. This film is absolutely fantastic. It's a black comedy. It's updated from the original play. They actually set the film version at Halloween. It's perfect Halloween watching because of that. And it, again, I know I was talking about the other Capra films being underrated, but most people don't even realize Capra made this. He made it before going into service in World War II, and it was shelved by Warner Brothers for a number of years because they had to wait until the the play stage run had finished before they were contractually allowed to release it. So it was shot and made in 1941, but not released until 1944. And the reviews were kind of mixed, and it's usually the fans of this film who've seen it and discovered it for themselves that have really cherished it and kept it alive. And it really is just a fantastic ball of fun. And there are elements of this that are perhaps the screwball comedy at its most frenetic. So it's also essential if you're a screwball comedy fan. And again, it's not talked about very often as actually being a Capra picture because it doesn't really feel like the typical standard Frank Capra feeling picture. Moving on to John Frankenheimer. This is the Warner Brothers release of Dead Bang. There are 2 catalog numbers of this with the same cover art, but this one is the one that has a digital soundtrack. So it has a Dolby Surround encoded PCM track. But like the DVD, this disc is also 133. It's an open matte transfer, and it's all out on widescreen. I think the Region 2 PAL DVD is actually letterbox, so if you get this DVD in Europe, it's actually shown widescreen properly. It's never been released on Blu-ray, and this was in Frankenheimer's later 80s period where he was really on the comeback of sorts. And I do think this film is underrated. It's not talked about very much, and yes, it is very 1980s, so there is the dated aspect to it, but that's always kind of pleasant in a way when the film's also very good. I don't think it's up near the level of, say, 52 Pickup, which is Frankenheimer's underrated 80s masterpiece, I'd argue. But it is very good, and it is a pure 80s action thriller with the right amounts of drama and fun. So, again, I think this is pretty underrated. But it's a nice Laserdisc, and not rare, not super easy to find, but you got to make sure that you get this particular catalog number with the identical cover that actually has a PCM track instead of just being analog only. Because Warner Brothers is just so great about not telling you the disc specs. Moving on to John Huston, this is the MGM reissue of the Asphalt Jungle, with really nice artwork. Again, this replaces the older analog-only version, so this is the one you want to pick up if you want this film on Laserdisc. And again, the art is really nice. Of course, Warner Brothers put it out on DVD in the film noir box sets, and Criterion put out the lovely Blu-ray, but the Laserdisc art is really nice. The transfer is very good, and again, it adds the all-important digital mono track. It does give you the original trailer, and this being later on in MGM on Laserdisc, in terms of this being a disc from, I believe it's from 1993. So it's not as easy to find as the older one that's not as good, but the transfer's been cleaned up. It's still a very nice way to watch the film, and I'd say was the first really good version you could get on disc, because anytime one of the studios would go back and revisit a title and actually, spiff it up, it was much nicer to experience than the super old disc. But yeah, this of course is a classic title. It's so influential that it's practically been ripped off a million times. But it's always fantastic to go back to and see where a lot of all the cliches everybody knows got started. Moving on to Ridley Scott titles. This one I've heard good stuff about the Laserdisc transfer and audio, so I wanted to pick it up. I think I saw this. I think we may have rented it when I was a kid, but I can't really remember much about it. So it'll be fun to actually watch this with fresh eyes. This is the letterbox release of G.I. Jane. It's a Disney disc technically, because I think this was Touchstone originally. It does have a PCM Dolby Surround encoded track, and of course AC3, which is what you're going to want to listen to. It is a later 90s film, so the pressing quality should be really nice. Again, a widescreen title that is one of these secret Disney discs. I take that back, it was a Hollywood Pictures release. And the original owner kept the gold Dolby Digital sticker and put it very nicely on the back cover, so that's pretty cool. It does have a Ridley Scott commentary and the original trailer along with a alternate opening. So it's not quite a full special edition, but again, I think it's very hard for a Ridley Scott title to be released on disc without at least some form of extras or deleted scenes or something. So it's pretty cool that they got all this on a Disney disc, because Disney discs are pretty well known for never having any sort of special features. I think between this and the Tombstone release with the extra scenes at the end, that's about it for their adult movie fare. But again, it'd be pretty cool to fire this up, and I've heard good stuff about this particular Laserdisc transfer. Speaking of that, moving on to Spielberg. This is one I never intended to pick up because it's just not something I exactly needed, but I found a cheap local copy, and so I was like, yeah, I'm getting this. So this is the AC3 reissue of Jurassic Park. It seems to pretty much use the old CAV box transfer, but it also seems a tad cleaner. But of course it adds the all-important AC3 5.1 that was not on the CAV box version. It's just 2 discs crammed in a non-gatefold sleeve, hence the creasing and such. But you usually don't find this as much, and so usually this goes for more than the CAV box, oddly. Again, I do think the transfer on here, even though it seems like it's the same, it feels like the picture quality is a bit cleaner than the CAV box, which always seems a bit noisy. But of course, you get CAV with that, whereas this is jumping back down to CLV. So it's a trade-off. But this is the only way to get AC3 on Laserdisc. And different people argue over the merits of the various audio tracks on different releases. Of course, simultaneously, they released a DTS version, which pretty infamously had the surround levels at a high rate, and the bass levels were at a certain level that were not exactly what was in the theatrical audio track, but that's, of course, a very rare disc, very expensive, and I was just happy to find this AC3 one to check out, because even this one is not very common. And usually this AC3 disc is about in the $10 to $20 range. So the fact I found it in the local bins for like $1.50, that was much better. So yeah, this was definitely coming home with me. Speaking of that, this one is an upgrade of one of the classic super desirable ultra late releases. So I need to pass on my original copy because I picked up a cleaner Saving Private Ryan. Of course, I talked about this disc before, so I won't really get into it again, but this is a super late release because, of course, it's a very late in the century film. This was done by Image, even though it's DreamWorks. Image was handling everybody's Laserdisc releases at the very end, and this was one of the... It's not in the very final wave, but it's in the last couple months of US Laserdisc releases. So it is a ultra late release, and simply because of the rarity, that still keeps the price up. So usually Saving Private Ryan copies will set you back somewhere between the $20 and $30 range. And you know, this transfer is exceptional for the format because this is a really hard film to transfer with the differing photographic styles, the handheld footage, and the desaturated color look. So I am amazed when I throw this on and how much they got into the composite Laserdisc format. That being said, it's not going to be able to hold a candle to the DVDs and, of course, the Blu-ray and now the new 4K UHD version. But for Laserdisc, it's astounding what they got in there. Of course, it carries a PCM Dolby Surround encoded track, but the big draw is the Dolby AC3, which some claim is more theatrically accurate. Some prefer the first DTS DVD. It's unknown whether the first Dolby DVD is the same as this Laserdisc track because they didn't always stay the same. And then, of course, there's the lossless Blu-ray track as well. So there's different opinions floating around online, but it does look and sound outstanding for Laserdisc. It does carry the THX stamp, but there's no extras, no special features. This was just a super late release, so just be happy that this movie came out on the format if you're a big fan of it. But again, because it's a super late release, they didn't print very many quantities, so that's what really drives up the value. But just super uncommon to find, you know, floating around at the local stores and stuff. So this was just a simple upgrade. Now this one is a title I never expected to find. It was in a group of discs that a seller was selling, and the price was right, so I was like, I've just got to go for it because I adore this film. I did pick up the definitive Indicator release, but this particular disc has some interesting history as well, so I couldn't help it because it is quite rare. This is one of the greatest horror films that has ever been made, directed by Jacques Tourneur, which is why it comes at this level of the director's shelf. But this is Night of the Demon, even though it's got the American Curse of the Demon title on here, with the fantastically designed demonic image here on the front. That's totally iconic, and then this pretty nice rendering of Dana Andrews' profile here. So even though it's on the standard Image style jacket with just the blank disc in the background, it looks really cool for the art, and I bet it would look even better if you had the VHS version. But the history of this disc is they actually located an original uncut British print because the American curse version was slightly cut down and resequenced, which is why they kept that around on the later DVDs and the Indicator Blu-ray, so you could watch that version if you wish. But they actually located the best available uncut British version that had been thought lost, and they actually used it to transfer for this disc. So this was pretty legendary, a legendary title that everybody spoke of and always wished they could see the full version. And this Laserdisc actually presented the very rare at the time uncut British version. It has digital PCM sound, so this is a cut above the standard image disc of the time. And the rear jacket is pretty good, even though it's super plain, but it's the importance of finally being able to see the entire version. But the irony is, the story goes, after they made this disc, apparently this rare uncut print was lost for a number of years. And when they went to make the DVD version, some of the same people who worked on this and who found it in the first place couldn't find it. And they were astonished that the studio could lose such an important piece of history just in that short amount of time. And they very luckily found a person who apparently, if I'm remembering the story correctly, apparently it had inadvertently been junked, and someone just saved it and took it home with them, and so they very graciously brought it back when they found out that's what happened. And that's been used for the various cleanups and restorations. Again, the new Indicator Blu-ray release is definitive. It presents 2 restorations of the film with both versions and a complete wealth of extras, just hours and hours of brand new extras, with just great love and care put into it. But this Laserdisc has an important place in history and is so quite rare that I just couldn't pass it up. Again, this is one of the truly great films of the horror genre. It is a masterpiece in every single sense, and Turner carried on the traditions of the films that he made with Val Lewton in the 1940s. So this is directly a successor to the absolute majestic Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie and The Leopard Man, the 3 films that he made with Lewton, and that started off the famous Lewton horror cycle at RKO. So if you've never seen this film, it's an absolute must. Definitely pick up the Indicator Blu-ray, but this Laserdisc is important for both being the first untouched presentation and also for the fact that that this was the first time they found that rare uncut print. Now this one is another one I've wanted to pick up for a very long time. I have the original Encore disc, but this one I've wanted to pick up because it added a digital mono track, and this is just one I always wanted to check out. It's not super common, so it's a lot rarer to be a title that pops up. Usually you see the original disc everywhere, especially the jacket that has Gene Shalit plastered all over it. But anyway, I was just very happy to finally pick this version up. This is also in the Encore series, but it is the digital sound upgrade of the Immortal Double Indemnity, directed of course by Billy Wilder. Beautiful rendering of the original artwork. It sort of has a sepia tone applied to it, which I guess gives it a sort of old-timey feel, but it is a much better jacket than the original one because it uses more of the sleeve for the art, and even though it has a very, funky fuchsia and pink Encore background, I think it looks much more pleasing to the eye. Of course, it doesn't really indicate anywhere that this has digital sound, but it actually does. It's pretty much the same old transfer, and just like the old disc, it has no chapter stops. So you can see side 1, none. Side 2, chapter 1 takes you to the very end where the theatrical trailer has been included because Universal cares about its viewers. So basically, I think the old disc also can potentially get some rot. So this is basically just a cleaner pressing a couple years down the road, and it adds a digital mono track, and you don't have Gene Shalit plastered all over the front cover. That's about it. This was the best release of the film for a long while. Image put out their DVD first, and then that went out of print. And then for years, it was either this or the expensive DVD until Universal put out their own cleaned up version in the Legacy Series DVD back in like 2005, 2006. I remember basically pre-reserving that at a store and getting out of school one day and having my parents drive me over to the I think it was a Borders actually where I had it reserved, and I remember getting strange looks because I was so excited to finally see a restored version of Double Indemnity with extras and stuff, and I had reserved it at the local Borders, and everybody was just staring at me because there was this this middle schooler who was pre-reserving a copy of Double Indemnity and using like all of my allowance on it, every bit of money I'd saved for months, because I was like, yes, I can finally see this with extras and cleaned up and see it for the 1,000th time. And yeah, I was that kid. But anyway, you can never have enough copies of the truly great films. And of course, you definitely need to pick up the Universal Blu-ray, which is really fantastic. It was the subject of a even newer restoration, and they used a better source than what the Masters of Cinema were able to use. But that Blu-ray in the UK is also really, really good. But if you want the film on Laserdisc, this is the particular edition to check out, even if it's not very fancy or anything. Now, speaking of fancier, this was a local find. It's a bit dinged up and crumpled because it was still sealed, but this is a extraordinarily underrated film from Wilder's later career, and I really like the art on here. So I wish the jacket wasn't so dinged up, but it was just an unbelievable find because this one is not common at all. I believe this disc was released in '97, so this is a late MGM release. Anyway, this is of the Wilder picture Avanti. And again, the cover art is really, really nice and striking and really fits the tone of the film. And it has the late era MGM Deluxe letterbox bar across the top. Of course, it has a digital mono track and includes the theatrical trailer. I think this was the first release of the film in widescreen as well, so that's also important. And this was ported over for the MGM DVD. Pretty much all those MGM DVDs of classics and the Wilder films were just ports of the latest Laserdisc master. Of course, this was handled by Image because it was already that late in the period, and MGM had handed off their Laserdisc division to them. So that's really, the trailer is really the only extra you get, but the cover art is really nice, and it's a really nice transfer. I just wish the really cool jacket wasn't so dinged up, but I was just very happy to find this. Again, I think all of Wilder's films are underrated for the most part, and very few people have ever seen any of the later films. Very few people have seen the early films, of course. So I think as time goes on, Wilder becomes more and more underrated. So I always try to do my part to turn the tide on that. But yeah, this is a little gem of a picture if you've never seen it, and a really cool Laserdisc version. And last for the directors, we have, of course, John Woo, and this is the standard Universal release of Hard Target. Like Timecop, I always thought I would pick this up if I found a good condition cheap copy, and I actually found both of these at the same time, so that was pretty cool. Of course, this is the theatrical cut, doesn't have any of the, harder action shots, for lack of a better term, that were in the uncut, unrated version. It doesn't have the DTS track either. That would be on the rare later DTS disc, but I just wanted to see this again and thought it'd be cool to fire up the Laserdisc. It has a Dolby Surround encoded digital track, and the original poster art looks really cool on the jacket. The rear, even though it's a little plain, it looks pretty cool, I suppose. No special features, so just a standard movie-only Universal release. But again, it's getting harder and harder to find, action titles in widescreen that are common but not beat to crap and not overpriced or something. So anytime I can pick one up, I'm game. So moving on to 3 new horror discs that I picked up. The first 2 are Hammer titles, and this first one is one I've wanted to get for an extremely long time. It was released pretty early on. I believe this is from the early 90s. Also with Horror of Dracula, and like that release is open matted, but it does have digital sound. And the reason why I wanted to pick it up is Hammer films are notorious for having different appearances and different source prints used on various transfers. Even later day and modern day transfers don't always get things right. So for my favorite Hammer titles, I wanted to pick up the best available Laserdisc versions. And with horror still being very collectible, and a lot of these Hammer titles did not get big print runs, they can still be relatively difficult to find, pretty scarce, and a little bit pricey. For example, that's why I still to this day have not gotten the open matte Horror of Dracula from Warner Brothers, because it still always eludes me. But I did finally pick up this one. This is the Warner's open matte release of Hammer's version of The Mummy, which is right smack dab in the middle of their initial classic period of horrors, which started with The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 and basically ran until you could probably argue it really stopped. The first golden age or first wave of Hammer horror stopped with The Brides of Dracula in 1960. So this is right in there with the absolutely gorgeous Jack Asher color photography. And but by this point, they had struck a deal with Universal and were actually able to use elements of the classic Universal horrors, which is why this film basically borrows elements from not just the original 1932 Universal Mummy, but also the various sequels. It starts in ancient Egypt, like the original, but eventually it transposes itself to New England, which is the setting of the third film, The Mummy's Tomb. And it also takes elements of The Mummy's Hand, and the mummy still has the tragic backstory, but he's much more the lumbering being controlled by various priests that was the subject of all of the 1940s Universal sequels. But basically, by taking elements from all of those, it becomes a really successful film in its own right. I'd argue this is this one is so good that it's better than all the 40s Universal sequels, and it's second only to the original 1932 film in terms of just all of the various mummy films that have existed over the years. It's not as immediately dramatically oriented. It has its own pace, so it's not as fast-paced as Horror of Dracula or Curse of Frankenstein. It's a bit more conventional, but it's also a bit more there's more depth going on. Because of the slower pace, you're able to just get into the settings a lot more than you are in those two films. So I think it kind of gets written off a bit more. It's not as highly regarded as those first two, but it really forms a trilogy of sorts if you were to look at the initial Hammer horrors. So these three films, Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, and The Mummy, really form the triumvirate of Hammer horror that really reinvigorated horror as a genre. So the importance of this film cannot be understated. And it's just like all of the early Hammers. It has great class and great style and is very intelligent. And of course, with the pairing of Cushing and Lee, you cannot possibly go wrong because both are absolutely fantastic, even though Christopher Lee has virtually no dialogue. And when he's playing the mummy, he acts with his physical performance, especially his eyes convey so much emotion, but his physical manifestation, his movement, his the way his arms jerk about, his gait, it's all just absolutely fantastic to watch, and it conveys so much emotion that you just simply do not get in the 1940s sequels, where you have the stereotypical mummy wandering around in bandages. But anyway, again, this is a Warner Brothers disc from the early 90s, so it's open matted at 133. It does include the original trailer, which is pretty cool, and the transfer on this is different to the DVD and later Blu-ray. I would suggest go ahead and get the Blu-ray because the restoration and presentation on there is sourced from the UK version, which came out first and had a bunch of extras. The US version doesn't have any extras, but the master is fantastic and the film looks and sounds great. So this Laserdisc is more of a curiosity for those like myself who enjoy seeing the various transfers, but I always just wanted to see what these older discs look like. Now, eventually, later on in the 90s, Image with Anchor Bay in partnership started doing these spiffed up special edition releases of Hammer titles. They didn't always have extras, but they were all widescreen. They would do commentaries, but most of them had special features. This one includes some theatrical trailers and TV spots. But they all did brand new transfers from negatives and interpositives and made an entire Hammer collection. These eventually started making their way onto DVD, and then they switched over to DVD to do a few more titles. But eventually all of these went out of print, and so for a long time before the current run of Hammer on Blu-ray, both here in the States and in the UK, started up, a lot of these elite Anchor Bay Hammer Collection Laserdiscs were still desirable, and they still are quite desirable actually, because they're well presented, and it would be really cool to have the entire run, but so far, this is pretty much my only one, and because it's in perfect shape and was pretty darn cheap for what these go for, I was just totally on board. So this is the Hammer Collection Elite Anchor Bay release of the classic Frankenstein Created Woman from 1967. So this is the fourth film in the Hammer Frankenstein cycle, and unlike the Dracula series they did, I think the Frankenstein series, with one exception, maintained a succinct level of quality throughout. I think all of the films are important. They're not all perfect, but they all are intelligent. This film is extraordinarily different because the character of Baron Frankenstein is played slightly differently, but it also is a film that is dealing not with just reanimating the dead, but with the metaphysical, because in this film, Frankenstein is not simply trying to create his own living being, but his goal is to actually isolate the soul of mortal man itself, and just the various thematic concepts and moral quandaries that brings up alone is a picture in and of itself, but the fact that you actually have a pretty good story with great direction and great performances in all of that is really something different, even for Hammer. So I do think all six of the main Frankenstein series are all truly great and real highlights among the later Hammer horrors. So anyway, this really nice glossy jacket is really sturdy, and again it fits in with the same style of the others, so they all match. You could put them side by side, and again they did most of the titles that were not owned by Warner Brothers or some of the other studios, because Hammer would have various foreign distribution deals at given times and make different films that would be released by different studios. So Universal and Warner Brothers kind of hung on to theirs, but Anchor Bay wound up doing most of all the other titles. This was mastered from the, I believe from the original interpositive, presented in the correct aspect ratio of 1:66:1. It has the original mono mix in PCM. Not all of these had the original mono tracks. Some, like Devil Rides Out, have a surround remix, which is unfortunate, but for the most part they have original audio, and they have nice liner notes. This one, like I said before, has the original trailer and some TV spots, and they were really trying to present the Hammer horror films with proper respect for the first time. So it's definitely amazing to be able to see the fruits of that labor. And it was about this time where the whole notion of Hammer horror was really starting to develop in the critical realm, instead of just being, laughed off as it was throughout Hammer's actual run. But anyway, if you've never seen this film or any of the Hammer Frankensteins, it's an absolute must. Again, these are far more intellectually driven than what you typically get in a horror film. And I think this is truly a great horror film. It's one of the best Hammer horrors. And again, with the other 5 films and the 6 films that form the main series that all starred Peter Cushing, I think they're all exceptional. Of course, the irony is that as soon as I got the Laserdisc, Shout Factory announced their restored version would be coming out on Blu-ray, so definitely pick up the Shout Blu-ray disc, which has a beautiful restored version with nice new extras and things. But if you're really inclined, you can pick up the Laserdisc as well. Moving on to the classic Universal horrors. This was a disc I did not know about for a long time. I didn't even know it existed. It's exceptionally rare, still goes for a significant dollar value. I think the only copies on the database go for at least $20 or $30 usually. So I was very happy to find this. I didn't even know this came out on Laserdisc for a long while. This was later on when they were doing the double features of the later horror sequels. So the sets like that included Ghost of Frankenstein with Dracula's daughter, things like that. But this one was printed in 1994 and I think was probably one of the last ones. But this is the double feature encore edition of the two Creature from the Black Lagoon sequels, Revenge of the Creature and Creature Walks Among Us. And again, this being one of the last of the classic horror monsters of Universal to be printed on Laserdisc, I just think they didn't print very many of these. Again, these are extraordinarily rare. You never see them, and again, I didn't even know these made it to Laserdisc. Later on in Japan, they did a final run, which are very rare, and the big titles like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Dracula, Frankenstein were reissued one more time over there, but the sequels weren't. So this is really, really nice. If you're a fan of these sequels, you'll have to pick this up to have them on Laserdisc. They each have PCM mono tracks, and each one is on a separate disc and this really nice gatefold. So, because they are a bit longer, and it's a later Universal gatefold, so you get this really nice liner note and panel for each film with really nice image choices, and it looks very, very classy. You also get each film has the theatrical trailer, and then they give you an extra chapter of some production photographs, which is really cool. And of course, both films are shown 1:3:3 on here, just like they were on DVD. It wasn't until later that they restored the original widescreen framing of the theatrical runs. But of course, this was during the transitional period of widescreen, and some theaters were not transitioned over yet, so seeing them in 1:3:3 is fine. Revenge of the Creature was actually shot in 3D like the original film, and that was not restored until the 3D Film Archives restoration. But when Universal put out the Blu-ray of these, they messed it up, so you still can't see it properly in 3D because one of the film transfers for one of the eye sides has a screwed up thing. I think it's some weird 720p res, and it just doesn't look right. So that's unfortunately never been fixed, but Creature Walks Among Us looks pretty nice on Blu-ray in the new HD restored version, but it's really cool to go back and see this Laserdisc version of each. This is very similar to how I saw each of these. I saw them first on VHS tape like most people did, so I was used to seeing them in 1:3:3 anyway, but again, I just didn't even know this set existed, so it was really cool to pick up and be one step closer to Universal horror completion, and this is definitely one of the rarest and hardest to find of Universal horror on Laserdisc. So yeah, just exceptionally difficult to find. If you stumble across one of these, just grab it, even if you're not a big fan of both of these creature sequels. I'm just amazed this came out. I did not even know it existed on Laserdisc until I found it by accident on a random eBay listing once. And of course, it would not be Laserdisc without a couple of box sets. So this one is a MGM grouping of various features. It's just, it's very typical to what MGM would do with similar in respects to their Thin Man set and their Tarzan set. So it's really just a grouping of features without any I don't think this actually has any special features, but it was the first release on home video for all of these in good quality to replace the earlier ones that didn't have all of the films. But anyway, so this is the MGM box set of the later Charlie Chan films, all starring Sidney Taller, after Warner Oland, of course, had passed away and, obviously was no longer around to play the role. So this was when the series had passed to MGM from Fox. And these have been reissued on DVD, but they use these old masters, so this will give you the better PCM audio quality. And I've always seen pieces of these. I've seen a good number of the various Charlie Chan films, but I've never actually taken the time to go through them chronologically. So I've found myself really wanting to finally, after finally getting into, you know, more of what would have been termed franchises back in the day had they known the term, even ones like Charlie Chan and Tarzan and others that passed from studio to studio. So these are all, you know, budget features aimed at a certain runtime, sometimes as the B feature on a double bill, and thus can all fit nicely into a multi-Laserdisc set like this. So like the Thin Man set is a thicker box, and they didn't print an insert, they printed everything on the actual back of the box, which is a bit different, but it's kind of cool in a way, so you don't have to fish around for the insert in the dark. But as you can see, it's no extras, but at least you get here the credits for each film, which also help you tell them apart, because with all these various titles and they're all made back to back, it's very easy to mix them up. Let me show you the inside, which is just a bunch of discs. So you get a bunch of discs in the MGM sleeve, and I don't think there's an insert. Oh no, you always get the bonus feature of a nice foam insert. But I have to say, it's pretty sturdy, and the box doesn't have any split seams or anything. But usually these turn up every once in a while, and again, because the DVDs are the exact same, watching the Laserdisc will give you the better audio track. But I'm going to have fun rewatching through these. I do think, I do think the character is undervalued, but of course it's not really a character most people are going to be very fond of in the very current PC era. But you know, these films do have historical importance, and they do have their own defenders, some of which are even in the Chinese community. But again, you do have to go in understanding that they're not always going to be the most sensitive to matters like that. But it's not just these films. There were other films, even the Mr. Moto series, where you have Peter Lorre playing a Japanese detective. So there were a number of things going on that were of a similar ilk. So it was not just the Charlie Chan series, but the Charlie Chan series, of course, did, you know, put a stereotype in a lot of people's heads, even if it wasn't necessarily intended. Now this one is a pretty difficult to come by box set. Unfortunately, it's missing a disc, but the seller had it marked at such a nice price, I figured I might as well get it, because at least it had 2 out of 3, and the set itself is pretty difficult to find. So this is the MGM box set entitled The Best of Bette Davis, which gives you 3 of her most famous films, Jezebel and Dark Victory and Mr. Skeffington. And just after I picked this up, it was announced that Jezebel will be released by Warner Archive on Blu-ray, and Dark Victory is coming from Criterion, and Mr. Skeffington is not coming from anybody. So at least we're getting 2 out of 3. And ironically, the one title that's missing in this set is Mr. Skeffington. So I'll at least be able to compare the Laserdisc to the DVDs and then the Blu-ray versions. But the reason why this box set is nice is it's from the early 90s, so the transfers are cleaned up. And no, actually, I take that back. I take that back completely. This is a 1997 box set, which means it's released by Image. The transfers are significantly cleaned up over the older ones. And you do get a little bit of extras in terms of trailers, and the fact that they don't advertise it, but the transfers are spiffed up, and they actually all have digital soundtracks. So they all have PCM mono tracks, which I believe all of the older discs for each of these did not have. Some, like, I know Jezebel was a very early analog only disc. I think Dark Victory had one as well, and I think Mr. Skeffington as well. But anyway, a lot harder to find. I just didn't quite realize this was a title from the late 90s that would help to explain the rarity and higher cost on disc. But yeah, a really nice set of 3 of Bette Davis's most iconic films. But again, I just wish this had all three of them. But I was just happy to actually finally pick a copy of this up. It does have a nice little insert with your chapter stops. And it's just one-sided, so. And as you can see, this is much later on, so you have the modernized final style of MGM label, but again, it's missing a title in here, so hopefully one day I can pick up one of these boxes that actually has Mr. Skeffington, or maybe Warner Archive will do it on Blu-ray at some point. And last, but certainly not least, a title I've wanted to pick up for most of my collecting days, but I just never found a copy that was, affordable, and, it doesn't have anything exclusive to it, but my curiosity was super high, and I love the packaging, so I finally picked up the Universal Signature Collection box set of Psycho, which looks really, really nice and is one of the better packaged boxes in the Signature line because it's a tighter box. So it's thicker cardboard on the sides, and it's not like the Jaws box where it's really thick and the sides kind of bow out, and it's a box and not just a plain gatefold. But again, has the standard Signature Collection line. It has the old style of art that was used on a lot of the video releases, with the shot of Marion screaming in the background of the Bates house, which looks really, really nice, even though it's not original poster artwork. The rear is fantastic, where it's black and with the blood red rendering all over it, and then the sort of jagged cutout of the infamous shower scene. And I also like how the actual large font credit titles have been replicated here on the disc. And this one is a bit better than the usual Signature line. It actually has THX mastering. The disc was pressed by Pioneer, so it is a bit spiffier in terms of transfer and contents than most Signature discs. It does have the making of documentary, and the couple of extras got recycled onto DVD, and then the Blu-rays, so all that stuff is carried over all through the years, but it all originated on Laserdisc, which is why the making of is in standard def. But anyway, you will get those with PCM audio, so if you like having even your interviews with lossless audio, well, then you can pick up this Laserdisc. But the reason why I wanted to check this out is I wanted to check out the mono track, because a lot of later releases have it in lossy quality or it's not very good, and then there's always the possibility of scrubbing of the audio and stuff. And for example, on Jaws, the mono is on the Blu-ray, but the mono on the Signature Collection box set is much better in fidelity. And I wanted to get this to check out the mono track versus even the UK Blu-ray, which is what I have, which has the mono track at a higher quality bit rate than the US disc does. And I have to say, this does actually sound better, so it is a scenario like Jaws. So I'd argue if you want the best sounding version of the film, you should pick up this Laserdisc. You do get this really nice booklet, and it's an actual full booklet, it's not just an insert. And it has the full art rendering of what's on the cover. Beautiful imagery, and just, again, they went the extra mile on this in terms of doing up this title on disc right finally, because they had had it in the old budget analog sound only version for the longest time. And it was also 133, which this film was shown widescreen in theaters, but I mean, there is a certain argument for the 133 framing, but it was not truly intended. I actually think it works well in a number of sequences, but again, this was the first time the film was presented in matted widescreen on video. Now here you have the chapter breakdowns, and then the making of, and that's picking up on site 3. So the film itself is on just a single CLV side, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, it's just a single CLV disc for the film, and then the making of takes over on disc 2. And the liner notes are really extensive, also with more great stills and great printing, and it runs all the way on to the other panel. So this was Universal finally putting their prestige title on disc with great care. And then, of course, the rear is a stylish shot of the shower head, because what else are you going to put there? And it's also pretty cool that you get custom labels for this particular release. It's not just signature labels, but they actually went the extra mile to give you these pretty cool Signature Collection black labels with the Psycho logo in red. So just another nice small touch that showed Universal was really putting the time in, which of course with their Hitchcock library they have never done again. So if I complain about anything on home video besides James Bond and Star Wars, it's usually the shoddy treatment Universal has done their Hitchcock library, and that extends back to their early Laserdisc too, but this is the lone exception in a lot of ways. So outside of the Vertigo and Rear Window restorations and some of the Blu-ray cleanup jobs, but this was definitely a huge leap forward in the right direction, and represents the best version of the film on a Laserdisc. So all in all, it's a really, really nice release. It's a bit pricier than your usual cheap signature disc. I would actually argue it's worth it for the mono track like the Jaws box is, but it's not exactly essential if you're not a diehard tech nerd like myself, or a completist and you'd like to have all the various versions. But it is nicely packaged, and it was the origin of most of the special features that have carried over to this day. So anyway, I'm just very pleased to finally have this and be able to add it to my Hitchcock Laserdisc shelf. Well, that's going to do it for this round of updates. I hope this has been informative as usual, and hopefully you learned about some various pressing notes and various disc editions and such. And hopefully I'll have a new update video sometime in the near future, but pretty much exhausted my new pickups for the time being. Then again, as soon as I say that, I turn around and have so many discs, I'm ready for a whole other update video. So until then, thanks everybody so much for watching, and keep spinning physical media.